My stepdaughter called me dad at her graduation. Her biological father sued me for parental alienation. He orchestrated the whole thing. Mia's voice rang clear across the auditorium when she accepted her diploma, thanking her parents for their support, especially her dad who never gave up on her. She pointed directly at me in the audience. My wife Angela squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her face. But 3 rows behind us, I heard Thomas make a sound like he'd been punched. Mia's biological father stood up abruptly, his face twisted with rage, and walked out of the graduation ceremony while people turned to stare. Angela whispered that we should have expected this, but I'd thought Thomas would at least make it through his daughter's graduation without causing a scene. What none of us knew was that Thomas had been recording the entire ceremony on his phone, and that single moment of Mia calling me dad would become the centerpiece of a lawsuit that would nearly destroy our family. I'm David, and 3 years earlier I'd married Angela, a divorced mother with the most complicated custody situation I'd ever seen. Mia was 13 when I entered their lives, a quiet kid who spent most of her time drawing in notebooks and avoiding eye contact with adults she didn't know well. Angela's divorce from Thomas had been brutal and drawn out over 2 years of fighting about everything from furniture to photo albums. They'd agreed to joint custody with Mia, spending alternating weeks at each house, but the animosity between them made every exchange tense and uncomfortable. Thomas was a corporate lawyer who specialized in contract disputes, which meant he knew exactly how to weaponize legal language to make Angela's life difficult. He'd send emails at midnight demanding clarification on custody schedule details, threaten legal action over minor disagreements about Mia's activities, and generally treat co-parenting like a negotiation where he held all the leverage. Angela worked as a dental hygienist and didn't have the resources to match his legal maneuvering, so she'd learned to pick her battles and document everything obsessively. Thomas had a new girlfriend named Patricia, who seemed nice enough during the few interactions we had at school events. But Angela said Patricia asked intrusive questions about our household whenever she saw Mia. What extracurricular activities was Mia doing at our house? What time did we put her to bed? Did she seem happy or stressed? The questions felt like intelligence gathering rather than genuine interest in Mia's well-being. My approach to becoming Mia's stepfather was cautious and deliberate, because I'd heard too many horror stories about stepparents who tried too hard or not enough. I let Mia set the pace for our relationship, never pushed her to call me anything other than David, and focused on being a consistent, reliable adult presence in her life. At first, she was wary of me the way kids are with new adults in their parents' lives, testing boundaries and watching to see if I'd disappear like other people had. But over months, she started opening up during our drives to her art classes, or while we cooked dinner together. She'd talk about school drama, friend conflicts, worries about whether she was good enough at drawing to pursue it seriously. I became someone she could talk to without the complicated history that existed between her and her parents. Angela was thrilled that Mia felt comfortable with me, especially because Thomas had been telling Mia that her mother's new boyfriend wouldn't stick around long. But our growing bond created an unexpected problem. Thomas started making comments during custody exchanges about how Mia talked about me constantly, suggesting it was inappropriate how much time we spent together, questioning whether I was trying to replace him as her father. The first warning sign I should have paid more attention to came 6 months into my relationship with Angela. Thomas showed up 15 minutes early for a custody pickup and walked into our house without knocking, something the custody agreement explicitly forbade. He found Mia and me in the kitchen making pancakes while Angela was still getting ready upstairs. Thomas stood in the doorway watching us for a full minute before Mia noticed him. She jumped, startled by his presence, and Thomas commented that it looked like they were having quite the domestic scene without him. He took several photos on his phone before Angela came downstairs and told him he needed to wait outside during pickups like their agreement specified. Thomas apologized, claiming he'd knocked but no one heard, and left with Mia. Later that evening, Angela got an email from Thomas's lawyer requesting clarification about my role in Mia's life and whether I'd undergone any background checks before being allowed unsupervised access to a minor. The implication was clear. Thomas was building a file about me, documenting my presence in Mia's life as if it were something suspicious or dangerous. Angela's lawyer responded that I was her spouse and had every right to be present in their home, but the incident made me hyper-aware of how Thomas might be watching and interpreting everything I did with Mia. The second warning sign came during Mia's 8th grade parent-teacher conferences. Thomas insisted on attending separately from Angela and me, which was his right under their custody agreement. But Mia's English teacher mentioned to Angela that Thomas had spent most of his conference asking questions about me specifically. Did I attend school events? Did Mia ever mention me in her assignments? Had the teacher noticed any changes in Mia's behavior or academic performance since I'd become part of her life? The teacher had been confused by the line of questioning since Mia's grades were excellent, and she seemed happy and well-adjusted. Thomas had apparently explained that he was concerned about the influence of a step-parent on his daughter's development and wanted to make sure the school was monitoring the situation appropriately. Angela was furious when she heard about it, seeing it as Thomas trying to paint me as some kind of threat when I'd done nothing but support Mia. We met with Angela's lawyer, who said Thomas's behavior was concerning, but not technically illegal. and that we should continue documenting everything while being careful not to give him any ammunition he could use against us. I started being obsessively careful about how I interacted with Mia, always making sure Angela was present during conversations, avoiding being alone with her even for innocent activities like homework help or rides to activities. The anxiety of being constantly monitored began affecting my relationship with Mia. She noticed I was pulling back and asked if she'd done something wrong. I tried explaining that I was just being careful about boundaries, but she interpreted it as rejection. She started spending more time in her room when she was at our house, stopped talking to me about school or her art, and generally seemed more withdrawn. Angela begged me not to let Thomas's manipulation tactics damage the bond I'd built with Mia, arguing that letting him control our household dynamics was exactly what he wanted. She was right, but I was terrified of doing anything that Thomas could twist into evidence of inappropriate behavior or boundary violations. 3 months of this careful distance passed before Angela finally confronted me about it. We were lying in bed one night when she said she couldn't watch me walk on eggshells anymore, that Mia was suffering because I was treating her like a legal liability instead of a kid who needed support from the adults in her life. I admitted I was scared of giving Thomas ammunition, but Angela pointed out that Thomas would find ammunition regardless of what I did. If I pulled away, he'd claim I was unstable and inconsistent. If I stayed engaged, he'd claim I was overstepping. We couldn't win by trying to appease someone who was determined to find fault. That conversation changed my approach. I stopped trying to manage Thomas's perception and started focusing on what Mia needed, which was a step-parent who was present and engaged, rather than distant and worried. I resumed our cooking together, our conversations about art and school, our weekend projects. Mia responded immediately, opening back up and returning to the comfortable dynamic we'd had before I started pulling away. But I also knew this decision meant Thomas would have more material to work with, more moments he could photograph or question or twist into evidence of whatever narrative he was building. The third warning sign should have been impossible to miss, but I was too focused on rebuilding my relationship with Mia to recognize the trap being set. Thomas started being unusually flexible about custody scheduling, agreeing to trade weekends when Angela needed to visit her sick mother, offering to take Mia for extra days when we had work commitments, generally being more cooperative than he'd been in years. Angela was suspicious of his sudden helpfulness, but her lawyer said to accept it as progress and document his cooperation as evidence that co-parenting was improving. What we didn't know was that Thomas was creating a pattern of documentation showing how often we relied on his flexibility, how frequently we asked him to take extra custody time, building evidence that we viewed him as a convenient babysitter rather than an equal parent. Mia turned 15 and started high school, which brought new complications to the custody arrangement. She wanted to join the debate team, which practiced after school 3 days a week. The practice schedule conflicted with Thomas's custody days, and he refused to drive her to practice or allow her to stay late at school on his time. He claimed the debate team was Angela's idea, and she could accommodate it during her custody days if it was so important. Mia was devastated because debate team met Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, which meant she'd miss more than half the practices if she couldn't attend on Thomas's days. Angela tried negotiating with Thomas, offering to handle all the transportation if he'd just agree to let Mia stay late at school on his days, but he refused. His position was that extracurricular activities needed to be mutually agreed upon in advance, and since he hadn't agreed to debate team, he wasn't obligated to accommodate it. Mia ended up joining anyway, which meant I drove her to practices on Thomas's custody days, picking her up from school and taking her home afterward. Thomas found out and sent a formal letter through his lawyer claiming I was interfering with his custody time and engaging in parental alienation by facilitating activities he hadn't approved. The accusation of parental alienation was shocking because I'd been so careful to support Mia's relationship with her father despite his hostility toward me. I never spoke negatively about Thomas in front of Mia, always encouraged her to spend quality time with him, and made sure she called him if anything important happened at school or in her life. Angela's lawyer responded to Thomas's letter with documentation of his refusal to accommodate Mia's extracurricular interests and pointed out that I was simply ensuring Mia could participate in an activity that was important to her development. But the accusation was now on record, part of a growing file that Thomas was building about my supposedly inappropriate involvement in his daughter's life. Looking back, I should have recognized this as the beginning of Thomas's larger strategy, but at the time it just seemed like another example of him being difficult about co-parenting. Mia was caught in the middle, feeling guilty that her desire to do debate team had created conflict between her parents. She apologized to me for causing problems, which broke my heart because she shouldn't have had to apologize for wanting to participate in normal teenage activities. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that the adults in her life needed to figure out how to support her interests regardless of custody schedules or personal conflicts. During Mia's sophomore year, something shifted in how she related to me. She started calling me David Dad sometimes, a hybrid that acknowledged both my first name and my role in her life. It felt natural and sweet, a reflection of how our relationship had evolved from cautious strangers to genuine family. Angela loved it, seeing it as evidence that Mia felt secure and loved in our household. But I noticed Thomas's reaction during custody exchanges when Mia would accidentally use the term in front of him. His jaw would tighten and his eyes would narrow, but he wouldn't say anything directly. Instead, he'd make comments to Mia about how her real dad was standing right there, how some people might forget who their actual parents were. Subtle digs that made Mia uncomfortable and confused. She started being more careful about what she called me, depending on who was present, creating an emotional compartmentalization that seemed unhealthy but necessary for managing her father's reactions. I told her she could call me whatever felt right to her, and she didn't need to adjust based on who was listening. But the damage was done. She was already learning to manage adult emotions by moderating her own authentic feelings. The situation escalated during Mia's junior year when she had a health scare that required emergency room treatment. Angela was at work and unreachable. Mia was at our house, and she'd developed severe abdominal pain that seemed like it could be appendicitis. I rushed her to the emergency room, stayed with her through tests and examinations, and called Angela as soon as I could reach her. I also called Thomas to inform him what was happening, as required by their custody agreement for medical emergencies. Thomas arrived at the hospital an hour later and was furious to discover that I'd been the one to bring Mia in and had signed consent forms for her treatment. He claimed I had no legal authority to make medical decisions for his daughter, that I should have waited for one of her actual parents to be available before taking her to the hospital. The ER doctor who overheard this conversation looked at Thomas with disbelief and explained that Mia had been in significant pain and needed immediate medical attention, that any responsible adult would have done exactly what I did. But Thomas wasn't concerned about Mia's welfare in that moment. He was concerned about maintaining his parental authority and preventing me from stepping into what he viewed as his role. Mia ended up being fine, just severe gas that mimicked appendicitis symptoms, but the incident became another entry in Thomas's growing file of evidence about my inappropriate involvement in his daughter's life. After the hospital incident, Thomas filed a motion with the court requesting modification of the custody agreement to include specific language about my role and limitations. He wanted court orders establishing that I had no parental authority over Mia, that I couldn't make educational or medical decisions, that I shouldn't be present during custody exchanges, and that Angela needed to ensure I maintained appropriate boundaries. His motion included a detailed account of every interaction he'd documented over 3 years, painting a picture of me as someone who was systematically trying to replace him as Mia's father. He included the photos from the pancake morning, statements from Mia's teacher about my presence at school events, the debate team transportation issue, and the hospital incident. Individually, each item was innocuous or even positive evidence of me being an engaged step-parent. But Thomas's lawyer had arranged them to create a narrative of me overstepping boundaries and engaging in parental alienation. Angela's lawyer said this was a common tactic in high-conflict custody cases, where one parent tries to limit the other parent's new partner's involvement by claiming boundary violations. We had to respond with our own documentation showing all the ways I supported Mia's relationship with her father and never tried to replace him. The court proceedings were exhausting and expensive. We had to hire Angela's lawyer for extensive hours, preparing responses, gathering witness statements from teachers and coaches about how well-adjusted Mia was, documenting every instance where I'd encouraged Mia's relationship with Thomas. Thomas had apparently been preparing for this motion for years, systematically building his case while we'd been oblivious to his larger strategy. His lawyer argued that I was engaging in a subtle form of parental alienation by being too involved in Mia's life, making it difficult for her to maintain appropriate boundaries between her step-parent and biological parent. They claimed Mia was becoming confused about family roles, evidenced by her calling me David Dad, and that this confusion was harmful to her psychological development. They brought in an expert witness, a psychologist who specialized in parental alienation, who testified about the dangers of step-parents overstepping their role. The psychologist had never met Mia or evaluated our family, but gave general testimony about how children in blended families could become alienated from biological parents when step-parents assumed too much authority. Angela's lawyer objected repeatedly to the relevance of this testimony since it wasn't based on our specific situation, but the judge allowed it. The proceedings required Mia to meet with a guardian ad litem, a lawyer appointed by the court, to represent her interests and make recommendations about custody modifications. Mia was 16 by this point, and terrified about being asked to choose between parents or explain her feelings about me. The guardian ad litem spent 2 hours interviewing her about our household, her relationship with me, how she felt about her father, and whether she felt pressured by anyone to prefer one parent over the other. Mia came home from that interview visibly shaken, saying she felt like she was being interrogated about her own feelings, that the lawyer kept asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch her saying something inconsistent. Angela held her while she cried and told her that none of this was her fault, that adults were supposed to protect kids from legal conflicts, not drag them into the middle of court battles, but the damage was done. Mia now understood that her natural affection for me was being used as evidence against us, that loving her step-parent was somehow proof that she was being alienated from her father. The psychological impact of that realization was devastating to watch. The guardian ad litem's report came back recommending no changes to the custody arrangement. The report noted that Mia had strong, healthy relationships with both parents and with me, that she showed no signs of being alienated from her father, and that I appeared to be a positive influence in her life who supported her relationship with both parents. The guardian ad litem specifically noted that Mia, calling me by various names, including terms that referenced my parental role, was age-appropriate and reflected the natural evolution of step-family relationships. The report recommended family counseling to help all adults communicate better, but found no evidence supporting Thomas's claims of boundary violations or parental alienation. Thomas's lawyer immediately filed objections to the report, claiming the guardian ad litem had been manipulated by Mia and hadn't properly investigated the concerning patterns of behavior. But the judge accepted the report's findings and denied Thomas's motion for custody modification. We thought we'd won. We thought the worst was over. We had no idea that Thomas's real plan hadn't even started yet. The custody hearing and guardian ad litem investigation had been expensive, costing us over $15,000 in legal fees that we couldn't really afford. Angela had to take out a personal loan to cover the costs. Money we'd been saving for Mia's college fund, now gone to defend against baseless accusations. But beyond the financial cost, the emotional toll on our family was severe. Mia became anxious about expressing affection toward me when her father might find out, started moderating her behavior in ways that seemed designed to avoid giving Thomas more ammunition. She stopped calling me David Dad and went back to just David, stopped talking about our family activities when she was with her father, essentially created two separate versions of herself, depending on which household she was in. Angela and I tried explaining that she didn't need to hide her feelings or change her behavior to manage her father's reactions, but the damage was done. Mia had learned that authenticity was dangerous, that loving the wrong people in the wrong way could trigger legal consequences for the adults she cared about. Watching a 16-year-old carry that burden was heartbreaking. I found myself pulling back again, not wanting my presence to cause more problems for Mia or Angela. I skipped some school events to avoid potential confrontations with Thomas, stopped attending Mia's debate competitions even though she wanted me there, generally tried to make myself less visible in her life. Angela noticed immediately and confronted me about repeating the same pattern that had hurt Mia 2 years earlier. She was right, but I felt paralyzed by the knowledge that everything I did was potentially being documented and weaponized against us. Things came to a head when Mia's art teacher nominated her for a regional competition that required parent permission forms. Mia was at our house when the forms came home and she asked me to sign them since the deadline was the next day and she wouldn't see Angela until after work. I hesitated, remembering Thomas's arguments about me overstepping parental authority, but Mia was looking at me with such hope and excitement about the competition that I couldn't bring myself to create bureaucratic obstacles to something she wanted. I signed the form as step-parent, with a note explaining that Angela would follow up with official parent signature, then helped Mia prepare her portfolio for submission. The art teacher accepted the form, and Mia got into the competition, but Thomas found out and immediately accused me of forging parental signatures and engaging in educational interference. He filed a complaint with the school, claiming I had no authority to sign permission forms, demanded the school implement policies, preventing step-parents from signing any documents, and threatened legal action if I continued to overstep my role. The school was caught in the middle, not wanting to create policies that would affect other blended families, but also not wanting to be involved in our custody disputes. They ultimately decided that step-parents could sign forms with a note indicating parent would follow up, which was exactly what I'd done. But Thomas succeeded in making me look like I'd done something wrong. During Mia's senior year, I started noticing Thomas behaving strangely during custody exchanges and school events. He was always on his phone, seemingly recording or photographing things, and he'd ask Mia weird leading questions in front of me and Angela about how she felt about various family situations. His girlfriend Patricia would attend events with him and also be constantly on her phone, both of them documenting everything. Angela's lawyer said this was probably just Thomas trying to gather more evidence in case he wanted to file another custody motion, and we should continue being careful about our interactions with Mia when Thomas was around. But something about the way he was behaving felt more calculated and purposeful than just general documentation. He seemed to be waiting for something specific, setting some kind of trap that we couldn't see yet. The tension made every interaction with Mia feel performed rather than natural, with all of us aware that Thomas might be watching and recording. College application season added new stress to an already tense situation. Mia wanted to apply to art schools, but Thomas insisted she should focus on more practical business or pre-law programs. He refused to complete his portion of financial aid forms for any art schools, effectively limiting where she could apply. Angela and I offered to cover whatever financial aid forms required from our end, but Thomas's refusal to cooperate meant Mia's options were limited. She was devastated that her father couldn't support her dreams, that he was willing to sabotage her future because he disagreed with her career interests. I helped her work on her art school applications anyway, spending hours reviewing her portfolio, practicing interview questions, and brainstorming essay topics. Mia was incredibly talented, with a distinctive style that art teachers said showed real professional potential. Her work explored themes of family and identity, often featuring fractured or split images that seemed to reflect her experience navigating between households and managing complicated relationships. When she got accepted to her dream school, Rhode Island School of Design, with a partial scholarship, it felt like validation that her talent was real and her dreams were achievable. But Thomas refused to attend the celebration dinner Angela organized and sent Mia a text saying he hoped she'd reconsider her plans before making a mistake that would limit her career options. The rejection hurt her deeply, but she was determined to pursue art regardless of his approval. Graduation was supposed to be a celebration of everything Mia had accomplished, despite the chaos of her family situation. Angela and I were incredibly proud of her maintaining excellent grades, developing her artistic talents, and staying emotionally healthy despite years of being caught in adult conflicts. The graduation ceremony was beautiful, with Mia graduating in the top 10% of her class and winning several art awards. When they called her name to receive her diploma, she walked across the stage with confidence and grace. The principal handed her the diploma and asked if she wanted to say anything to the audience. Most students just thanked their parents and moved along, but Mia took the microphone and gave a short speech about resilience and family. She thanked her mom for being her rock through everything, thanked her teachers for believing in her talent, and then specifically thanked her dad for never giving up on her even when things got complicated. She pointed directly at me in the audience when she said it. The moment felt perfect and pure. A teenage girl publicly acknowledging the step-parent who'd supported her through some of the hardest years of her life. Angela was crying. I was trying not to cry, and everyone around us was applauding. But then I heard Thomas make that sound behind us, and watched him stand up and storm out of the auditorium. Patricia followed him quickly, both of them leaving before the ceremony even ended. Angela whispered that we should have expected Thomas to make Mia's graduation about him somehow, but I was just trying to enjoy the moment and not let his reaction ruin what should have been a purely happy occasion. After the ceremony, we found Mia outside taking photos with friends. She looked worried and asked if her dad was mad that she'd called me dad in her speech. Angela assured her that Thomas's feelings were his own responsibility and she shouldn't feel guilty about expressing her authentic feelings. But Mia was clearly anxious about having caused problems, which made me angry that even in this moment of triumph, she had to worry about managing her father's emotions. We took her out for a celebration dinner with family and friends, tried to focus on her achievements and her future, but the shadow of Thomas's dramatic exit hung over everything. 3 days later, we received legal documents that changed everything. Thomas was suing me personally for parental alienation, claiming I had systematically undermined his relationship with his daughter over 4 years, culminating in her publicly rejecting him as her father at graduation by calling me dad instead. The lawsuit demanded $150,000 in damages for emotional distress, legal fees for supervised therapeutic visitation to repair his damaged relationship with Mia, and a court order prohibiting me from having any contact with Mia until she turned 18. The lawsuit was filed in civil court rather than family court, which meant different rules and potentially more expensive proceedings. Thomas was using his expertise as a corporate lawyer to weaponize the legal system in ways that family court wouldn't allow. His complaint was 30 pages long, detailing every interaction he'd documented over 4 years, interpreting each one as evidence of my deliberate campaign to alienate Mia from him. The pancake morning was presented as me inserting myself into father-daughter time. My attendance at school events was characterized as me overshadowing Thomas's presence as her real parent. The debate team transportation was framed as me deliberately scheduling activities during his custody time to limit his involvement. The hospital incident was described as me making unauthorized medical decisions to establish myself as the primary parental figure. And Mia's graduation speech was presented as the culmination of years of systematic alienation, the proof that I had successfully replaced Thomas in his daughter's affections through manipulative and calculated behavior. Reading through the complaint was surreal because it took every positive thing I'd done as a step-parent and twisted it into evidence of malicious intent. Angela's family lawyer wasn't qualified to handle civil litigation, so we had to hire a different attorney who specialized in defending against parental alienation claims. Our new lawyer, a woman named Victoria who'd handled several similar cases, said Thomas's lawsuit was unusual, but not unprecedented. She'd seen vindictive parents use civil court to punish their ex-spouse's new partners when family court didn't give them the results they wanted. The challenge was that parental alienation cases were highly subjective and depended heavily on how judges interpreted behavior and intent. We'd need to prove not only that I hadn't engaged in alienation, but that Thomas's lawsuit was frivolous and filed in bad faith as retaliation for losing his custody modification motion. Victoria requested all of Thomas's documentation through discovery, which revealed the extent of his planning. He had thousands of photos and videos spanning 4 years, showing me at Mia's school events, picking her up from activities, cooking with her, helping with homework, essentially documenting every aspect of my presence in her life. He had emails and text messages between Angela and me discussing Mia's schedule, her needs, her conflicts with Thomas. He had social media posts where friends or family had referred to us as Mia's parents, plural, which he claimed was evidence we were encouraging others to see me as her father, rather than acknowledging Thomas's role. Most damning in his collection was a recording of Mia's graduation speech where she called me Dad, which he'd captured on video along with my emotional reaction and Angela's tears. He'd also recorded the moment after the ceremony where Mia had asked if her dad was mad, and our response encouraging her not to worry about his feelings. Thomas's lawyer had edited these recordings to create a narrative where we were actively coaching Mia to reject her father and embrace me as his replacement. The recordings were misleading and taken out of context, but they were powerful pieces of evidence that would be difficult to refute in court. Victoria said we needed to build our own counter-narrative with evidence showing Thomas's history of using the legal system to harass and control, his refusal to support Mia's interests and dreams, and the ways his behavior had damaged his relationship with his daughter, independent of anything I'd done. We started gathering our own documentation, reaching back through years of emails, text messages, and court filings that showed Thomas's pattern of conflict and control. Angela had kept meticulous records of his behavior, thank God, because now we needed every piece of evidence we could find to defend against his accusations. The discovery process revealed something we hadn't known. Thomas had been consulting with a parental alienation expert for over 2 years, someone who specialized in helping alienated parents document evidence and build legal cases. This expert had apparently coached Thomas on what to photograph, what questions to ask Mia, how to create a paper trail that would support alienation claims. The expert's notes, which we obtained through subpoena, showed that Thomas had been following a specific strategy designed to paint me as an alienator regardless of my actual behavior. The notes included suggestions like document every instance where the stepfather is present at school events, record conversations where the child uses parental terminology for the stepfather, gather evidence of the mother allowing inappropriate boundary violations. Thomas had been following this playbook for years, which meant every friendly interaction I'd had with Mia, every school event I'd attended, every moment of genuine connection between us had been documented as evidence for this eventual lawsuit. The realization that our entire family life had been surveilled and weaponized was horrifying. Mia felt betrayed when she learned her father had been recording and photographing her for years, not to preserve memories, but to build a legal case. She stopped taking his calls and refused to go to his house for her custody weekends, which of course Thomas blamed on me and Angela rather than his own behavior. Victoria explained that Mia's refusal to see her father would actually help Thomas's case because it appeared to prove his point about alienation. The fact that she stopped contact after learning about the lawsuit and documentation could be presented as evidence that we'd turned her against him. We were trapped in a situation where Thomas's behavior created the very alienation he claimed I'd caused, but the timeline made it look like cause and effect ran the other direction. Victoria advised Mia to resume some contact with her father to demonstrate that she was capable of maintaining a relationship with him independent of the lawsuit, but Mia refused. She was 18 now, legally an adult who could make her own decisions about relationships, and she'd decided her father's betrayal was unforgivable. Watching her go through this was painful, because I knew part of her anger and hurt was guilt about the lawsuit, feeling responsible for the legal and financial chaos her graduation speech had triggered. Angela and I repeatedly assured her that Thomas's decision to sue was about his own issues and control needs, not about anything she'd done wrong, but the guilt persisted. The lawsuit moved forward with depositions scheduled for all parties involved. I had to sit in a conference room for 8 hours, while Thomas's lawyer asked detailed questions about every interaction I'd ever had with Mia. Did I intend to replace Thomas as Mia's father? Had I encouraged her to call me Dad? Did I understand that I was a step-parent with no legal parental authority? Had I deliberately scheduled activities during Thomas's custody time? On and on. Questions designed to make normal step-parenting behavior sound suspicious and malicious. My answers were consistent and truthful. I'd simply tried to be a good step-parent who supported Mia while respecting her relationships with both biological parents. But Thomas's lawyer was skilled at making everything sound like calculated manipulation. When I explained helping Mia with debate team logistics, it became me deliberately interfering with Thomas's custody time. When I described our cooking together, it became me creating artificial bonding experiences to replace her father. When I mentioned being there for her during hard times, it became me positioning myself as her primary emotional support in ways that undermined Thomas's role. The deposition was exhausting and demoralizing, making me question whether I'd done anything right in 4 years of trying to be a good step-parent. Angela's deposition was even worse because Thomas's lawyer accused her of deliberately exposing Mia to an inappropriate step-parent relationship as part of her ongoing campaign to alienate their daughter from him. They brought up every custody conflict from their divorce, every disagreement about Mia's activities or schedule, reframing Angela's attempts at co-parenting as evidence of her hostility toward Thomas and desire to minimize his role in Mia's life. Angela stayed calm through most of the deposition, but broke down when the lawyer suggested she'd been a bad mother who prioritized her new marriage over her daughter's need for a healthy relationship with her father. I watched through the conference room window as Angela sobbed and felt rage at Thomas for putting her through this, for weaponizing the legal system to torture his ex-wife and her new husband because his daughter had dared to express affection for her step-parent. Mia's deposition was scheduled last, and Victoria prepared her carefully for the types of questions Thomas's lawyer would ask. But nothing could really prepare an 18-year-old to be questioned about her feelings toward her parents and step-parent, while lawyers took notes and transcripts were recorded for use in court. Mia was nervous and defensive, which made her sound angry and alienated, even though she was just scared. Thomas's lawyer asked if she loved her father, and Mia said yes, but added qualifications about him not supporting her dreams and using her as a pawn in legal battles. The lawyer asked if she loved me, and Mia said yes without qualification, which was presented as proof that I'd succeeded in replacing her father in her affections. The lawyer showed Mia the video of her graduation speech and asked her to explain why she'd called me Dad instead of using my name. Mia explained that it felt natural in the moment, that she'd been trying to thank everyone who'd supported her, and I'd been more involved in her education than her father had been. The lawyer asked if anyone had told her to say that, if Angela or I had coached her on what to say at graduation. Mia was offended by the suggestion and said no one tells her what to say or how to feel, that she was 18 years old and capable of making her own decisions about relationships. But her indignation was presented as evidence of how thoroughly I'd alienated her from her father, how she couldn't even recognize the manipulation she'd been subjected to. After the depositions, Victoria said we had strong evidence that Thomas's lawsuit was retaliatory and that his own behavior had damaged his relationship with Mia more than anything I'd done. But she also warned that parental alienation cases were unpredictable and judges sometimes sided with alienated parents even when evidence suggested the parents' own behavior contributed to the problem. We were looking at a trial that could cost another $50,000 in legal fees, money we absolutely didn't have after the previous custody battle and now defending this lawsuit. I started seriously considering whether I should just stay away from Mia until this was resolved, whether my presence in her life was causing more harm than good, given the financial and emotional toll on our family. Angela wouldn't hear of it, arguing that letting Thomas's legal harassment succeed in driving me away from Mia would teach her that manipulation and abuse of the legal system worked. But I was drowning in guilt about the money we were spending, the stress Angela was under, the way Mia's relationship with her father had completely deteriorated. Maybe I should have been more careful, more aware of how Thomas might interpret my involvement in Mia's life. Maybe I should have maintained stricter boundaries, even though it felt unnatural and harmful to Mia. The second guessing was exhausting and counterproductive, but I couldn't stop wondering if there was some way I could have avoided this catastrophe. Then Victoria made a discovery that changed everything. She'd subpoenaed Thomas's phone records and found hundreds of calls and text messages between Thomas and his parental alienation expert, starting 2 months before I even met Angela. The messages showed Thomas discussing his ex-wife's new boyfriend, strategizing about how to document behavior that could be used to claim alienation, planning a long-term legal strategy to limit my involvement in Mia's life. The expert had literally coached Thomas on what to look for and how to interpret normal step-family dynamics as evidence of alienation. But more damning were messages from the week before Mia's graduation, where Thomas's expert had suggested he needed a dramatic public moment to anchor his lawsuit, something that would clearly demonstrate how far the alienation had progressed. The expert had written that graduation would be an ideal opportunity, that if Mia acknowledged the stepfather publicly, it would be powerful evidence, and Thomas should make sure to record everything. Thomas had responded asking what he should do if Mia did acknowledge me, and the expert had replied that he should react emotionally and document his reaction, that his devastation at being rejected by his daughter would be part of the evidence package. Thomas had literally planned to storm out of graduation if Mia mentioned me, had coordinated his dramatic reaction as part of his legal strategy. Most importantly, we found messages from the morning of graduation where Thomas had texted Mia asking what she planned to say in her speech. Mia had apparently told him she wanted to thank everyone who'd supported her, and Thomas had responded encouraging her to speak from her heart and say whatever felt true to her. It seemed like innocent father-daughter communication, but Victoria recognized it as entrapment. Thomas had known there was a good chance Mia would mention me in her speech, had encouraged her to speak authentically, and had positioned himself to document his reaction when she did exactly what he'd predicted. He'd essentially coached his own daughter to provide the centerpiece evidence for his lawsuit, manipulating her into a situation where expressing her genuine feelings would trigger the legal consequences he'd been planning for years. The text messages were devastating evidence that Thomas had orchestrated the entire situation. Victoria filed an emergency motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that Thomas had manufactured the evidence through entrapment and manipulation, that his entire case was built on deliberately creating the appearance of alienation, rather than documenting genuine damage to his relationship with Mia. She included the text messages, the communications with his expert, and a detailed timeline showing how Thomas had been planning this lawsuit since before I'd even become a significant part of Mia's life. Thomas's lawyer fought the dismissal motion, arguing that the text messages showed nothing improper. A father encouraging his daughter to speak authentically at graduation wasn't entrapment, they claimed, and consulting with experts about parental alienation was responsible parenting, not evidence of manufactured claims. But the judge who heard our motion was troubled by the timeline and the communications with the expert. She asked Thomas's lawyer directly whether Thomas had expected Mia to mention me in her speech, and whether he'd planned his reaction in advance. The lawyer's careful non-answer was essentially an admission that yes, Thomas had anticipated and prepared for exactly what happened at graduation. The judge took 2 weeks to issue her ruling, 2 weeks where we existed in suspended animation, not knowing if this nightmare would continue or finally end. Mia had started therapy to deal with the trauma of learning her father had been documenting her life as part of a legal strategy. Angela was barely sleeping, consumed with worry about money and Mia's emotional state and whether we'd ever be free of Thomas's harassment. I felt like I was walking through fog, unable to focus on work or anything beyond the lawsuit. When the judge's ruling finally came through, it was better than we'd hoped for. She dismissed Thomas's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile the same claims. She found that Thomas had engaged in entrapment and manufactured evidence, that his communications with the parental alienation expert showed planning and premeditation inconsistent with genuine concern about his daughter's welfare, and that his behavior suggested the lawsuit was filed for purposes of harassment rather than legitimate redress of injury. The judge specifically noted that Mia's graduation speech appeared to be an authentic expression of her feelings toward her step-parent, and that Thomas had deliberately created conditions likely to elicit that expression for purposes of building his legal case. She ordered Thomas to pay our legal fees under the state's frivolous litigation statute, which meant we'd eventually recover some of the money we'd spent defending ourselves. And she issued a restraining order preventing Thomas from filing any further legal actions against me without first obtaining permission from the court, essentially protecting us from future harassment through the legal system. We'd won, but victory felt hollow and exhausting rather than triumphant. The financial damage was severe, even with the promise of eventual reimbursement for legal fees. The emotional damage to Mia's relationship with her father appeared permanent, and the years of stress and surveillance had taken a toll on all of us that wouldn't be easily healed. Mia didn't speak to Thomas for 6 months after the lawsuit was dismissed. She was focused on starting college, building a new life, away from the dysfunction that had defined her teenage years. When Thomas finally reached out to her with an apology, she agreed to limited contact, but made clear she didn't trust him and might never forgive him for what he'd put our family through. Their relationship now consists of occasional awkward dinners and surface-level text conversations, nothing like the close father-daughter bond Thomas claimed to be fighting for. Looking back, I can see how every moment of our family life was poisoned by Thomas's documentation and strategizing, how we were all performing our relationships under surveillance without realizing it. But I can also see that despite his efforts to destroy my bond with Mia, the relationship survived because it was built on genuine care and respect rather than manipulation. Mia still calls me dad sometimes, not as frequently as before, but occasionally when it feels natural. She knows now that her feelings toward me were used as weapons, that her graduation speech triggered a legal nightmare, but she refuses to moderate her authentic emotions to appease her father's insecurities. She's 20 now, thriving at art school, creating beautiful work that continues to explore themes of family and identity and survival. Angela and I are still recovering financially from the legal battles, still dealing with occasional anxiety about whether Thomas will find new ways to harass us despite the restraining order. But we're also stronger as a family, bound together by having survived Thomas's attempts to destroy us. The whole experience taught me that being a step-parent means navigating impossible situations where your best intentions can be weaponized, where loving your stepchild openly can trigger legal consequences, where every moment might be documented as evidence against you. But it also taught me that authentic relationships survive manipulation attempts, that kids are resilient and capable of recognizing who genuinely supports them, and that sometimes the people who claim to be fighting for their children are actually fighting to maintain control and punish their exes. I wish I could say we all lived happily ever after, that Thomas learned his lesson and became a better father, that Mia fully healed from the trauma of being used as a pawn in adult conflicts. But real life is messier than that. Thomas still believes he was the victim, still thinks I stole his daughter through manipulation. Mia still carries scars from having her feelings weaponized, and I still second-guess myself sometimes, wondering if there was some way I could have been a good step-parent without triggering such extreme retaliation. But when Mia comes home for breaks from college and we cook together like we used to, when she shows me her latest artwork and asks for my input, when she casually calls me dad while telling a story, I remember why all the legal and financial chaos was worth it. I didn't steal Thomas's daughter. I just loved her consistently and supported her dreams, and that was enough to build something real that survived 4 years of legal warfare. The relationship between a step-parent and stepchild is complicated and beautiful, and sometimes painful, existing in a space that biological parents don't always understand or accept. But for kids growing up in blended families, having multiple adults who genuinely care for them isn't confusing or harmful. It's a gift. Thomas could never understand that loving Mia didn't diminish his role as her father, that she had space in her heart for multiple parental figures without betraying anyone. His jealousy and need for control cost him the very relationship he claimed to be protecting. That's the real tragedy of the whole situation. Not that Mia called me dad at her graduation, but that her father couldn't celebrate having another person in her life who loved and supported her. The story isn't over. Mia's relationship with Thomas will continue to evolve as she gets older. The financial impact of the legal battles will take years to fully resolve, and I'll continue navigating the complicated role of being a step-parent who loves their stepchild fiercely while respecting the reality that I'm not and will never be their biological parent. But I'm not afraid anymore of being too present or too involved in Mia's life. I learned that trying to manage Thomas's perceptions and avoid giving him ammunition meant sacrificing authentic relationships for the illusion of safety. And that wasn't fair to Mia, who deserved step-parents who were fully present rather than constantly worried about legal consequences. So now I'm just myself, a guy who loves his stepdaughter, supports her dreams, and refuses to let fear of future legal harassment prevent me from being the family she deserves. If Thomas ever tries to weaponize the legal system against us again, we'll be better prepared. But more importantly, we'll know that surviving his first attempt made us stronger and more confident in the legitimacy of our family bonds. That graduation speech where Mia called me dad wasn't evidence of parental alienation. It was evidence of a kid brave enough to publicly acknowledge the people who actually showed up for her, regardless of biology or legal titles or her father's disapproval. And I'll always be grateful she had that courage, even though it came with such a high cost. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.